Yes, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this very afternoon, right here for the Singapore International Cyber Week 2023. My name is Charlene, pleased to be your MC. Please give yourself, as well as everyone around you, a big round of applause. Thank you for your presence this afternoon. Yes, we are here today as we have the Singapore International Cyber Week high-level panel on securing the future. Public-private partnerships for cyber resilience. Now, there will be opportunities for all of you to raise your questions during our Q&A segment later. So you can simply share your question through the Slido by scanning the QR code as shown on the screen. So do seize these opportunities to interact with our panelists during the discussions later. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you are aware and you can recall the SolarWinds hack in the year 2020. Now, we saw how a breach of a single company can trigger a much larger supply chain incident affecting thousands of organizations, including government systems. So given how interconnected we are in this increasingly complex cyber environment, it is becoming very clear that we cannot hope to be secured in the shared digital space without working together. So today we're indeed honored to have with us esteemed panelists, and we will be discussing on the public-private partnerships for cyber resilience and what makes one a success. All right, ladies and gentlemen, before we dive in, we'd like to do a quick polling. So let's take part in this poll. To do so, simply scan the QR code on the screen. And the question for the poll is, which is the most essential factor for achieving successful public-private partnerships to strengthen cyber resilience? Let us hear your views. So do you feel that the key success factor is, first, government regulations and policies? Or is it the second, information sharing arrangements? Third, platforms for regular collaboration? Or is it the fourth, incentives and benefits? So go ahead and let us know your views. All right, so moving on to our panel discussion for this very afternoon, let's dive deeper to the topic of public-private partnerships for cyber resilience. So please join me to welcome our panelists for this afternoon. Let's put our hands together for Air Marshal Darren Godey. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause, please, for National Cybersecurity Coordinator, Department of Home Affairs, Australia. Let us also welcome Ambassador Benedict Wexler, Head of Digitalization, Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Switzerland. Joining us in our midst, Ambassador Brian D. Metfitas, Senior Vice President and Regional Managing Director, U.S. ASEAN Business Council. And a round of applause for Mr. Brett Arkin, Senior Vice President and Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cisco. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Casey Choi, Executive Vice President, General Manager of Global Mobile, B2B, B2G, Team, Mobile Experience Business at Samsung Electronics. All right, ladies and gentlemen, moderating this very segment for the afternoon, our moderator is none other than Ms. Hua Pui Lee. Let's give her a big round of applause. And she's a Senior Director of Policy and Corporate Development at the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. And today we're here to dig the brains of all our panelists. So I'm going to like to hand the time over to Pui Lee. Pui Lee, please.
Thank you, Charlene. Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SICW high-level panel discussion on securing the future, public-private partnership for cyber resilience. I'm Pui Lee, or Pui in short, your moderator for this session. In our increasingly interconnected and digitalized world, ensuring cybersecurity and resilience is a collective responsibility. And over the years, both public as well as private sectors have come to recognize that effective cyber protection can only be achieved through collaboration. And indeed, collaborative efforts between government entities and private organizations have become essential to protect critical infrastructure, enable the digital economy, and to protect our way of life. And really, there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to collaborations. And we need to adopt targeted, multi-pronged approaches to meet the diverse needs of industries and sectors. And there are various areas that can benefit from PPPs, public-private partnerships in short, from threat and intelligence sharing, incident response, operational readiness to safeguard critical infrastructure, and to innovation and capability building for the cyber ecosystem. So today we have a very remarkable lineup of distinguished panelists comprising leaders of both the public and private sectors who are here to share with us their insights and perspectives. So before we dive into our discussion today, let's start with the result of our audience poll. So to recap, the question that was raised was, what is the most essential factor to achieve successful public-private partnerships to strengthen cyber resilience? So I think our results are fairly distributed across government regulations and policies, platforms for regular collaboration, incentives and benefits, and 9% for information sharing arrangements. So maybe I can then start off by asking Mr. Darren Goldie on his broad comments on the factors that have come up through this audience poll and what he thinks are essential factors for achieving PPPs.
Well, I'll start by complimenting all the vendors for voting up platforms for sale. I actually would go with the lowest percentage there. If we bank trust as being the first thing that we need when we're working between the public and the private sector, if we assume that's happening, to me it's about the arrangements. What do we want the public sector to be doing? What do we want to be doing together? And what do we want the private sector to be doing? And the private sector is not a charity. They shouldn't be devoting resources to doing things that the state is never going to ask them to do. And the state doesn't need to be doing things that the private sector should be doing. So I think those clear lines of demarcation are really important.
Great. Ambassador Wexler, would you like to comment?
Thank you, and thanks for having us. And actually, I went with the incentives and benefits because our experience is, as you say, if the private sector engages, they want to see results. And so we have started, for instance, a dialogue with the private sector under the umbrella of the Geneva Dialogue, which is really looking at how they can really implement rules, code of conduct that have been agreed on a political level. And that's what the private sector is really looking for. How do we have to do this? Because they, I'm rather, the tech companies get a bit of bashing sometimes, but I think they're good. They're in good faith. Of course, they need to answer their shareholders, but they want to be the good ones. But I think sometimes we have to help them a little bit more to do it. And I think also what's important is that they also want to see real commitments, so that they know, well, if I agree with these commitments, I do a special effort, I want to do that my neighbor does it as well. So that's something, again, where we then have to do our public part, that we can really make them also accountable, and they want these strong rules also be enforced then.
Great. Ambassador McPherson.
Well, thank you, Pui. I would go for the one that got the most vote. I didn't vote, but platforms for regular collaboration. In a sense, that's maybe self-serving because I represent an organization that is essentially a platform. US-ASEAN Business Council is an organization of 185 companies. We have an expert member here, so I won't get into the cyber issues myself. But what I would say is, I guess as a layman, I say, let's say that we sat down today and came up with the perfect answers. And then we met in 3 months. Would those answers still be valid, right? So it's a constantly changing, even to a layman, it's a constantly changing and accelerating area. So set up platforms for regular collaboration. US-ASEAN Business Council could be one of them. Talking to businesses, convoking meetings on things like artificial intelligence, meeting ASEAN officials at the high level, because we know that ASEAN has different capabilities and different modalities in terms of how they approach this. So that's a bit of an infomercial, but I think we see ourselves as part of the solution over the long term, just being a platform, being open, and putting the experts together.
Thank you so much. Exactly, I think this is the reason why we have a range of panelists from very diverse backgrounds today. Brett and then
So
Casey.
I voted for the incentives and benefits, and I would argue that government regulation and policies is just a special case of more generic incentives and benefits. And so depending which direction you want to go. And the other two, information sharing and platforms, particularly on the private side, we're not going to engage with these vectors unless there's some incentive or benefit that drives us to do that. Because there's always trade-offs, there's other things we could be doing. And so there needs to be a compelling reason to go belly up to the bar and work on those vectors of interaction. And Jen Easterly before lunch was talking about the values of incentives and benefits, and I think she captured that really well, that it's really what drives change and behavior for what we're trying to get done here.
Great. Casey?
So first off, Pui, thanks for having us here today. I'm gonna kind of game this a little bit and pick the lowest one and the highest one, because I think it was interesting that we started the comments today on SolarWinds, because it seemed like a long time ago, but it was only really 3 years ago when that happened. And if you recall, and I'm not going to recount all the details of it, but one of the things that was at the heart of the SolarWinds breach was the fact that it had really to do with the basics. And in this case, it had to do with GitHub and basic password policies that were not enforced that allowed for that hack to occur. So it wasn't that sophisticated an issue, but it had broad-ranging impact. And when I go to the information sharing and the platform piece, I think one of the elements that's a key part of that, and we certainly deal with it quite heavily as a device manufacturer, is really the awareness and education aspect of this. Is how do we ensure that all of the capabilities that are built into these platforms, and as these platforms evolve, they're even going to get more sophisticated as far as the capabilities that we'll have at the endpoint. But unless they're enacted and the policies are there and they're trained with the individuals that are in our organizations, without that awareness, I think we still leave ourselves open to these types of potential vulnerabilities. So I think the human element piece really kind of, and again, the collaboration and the information sharing piece really takes a lot of precedence. It's certainly one that we're very focused on as far as, again, informing the consumer and the user on what is available and what can be done to, again, protect ourselves.
Thank you so much. We'll have time to delve into each of these factors, I think, following in deep dive discussions. Let us start off with the government regulations and policies factor, which garnered 29%. And in fact, public-private partnerships in the cyber domain started more than 2 decades ago. And in the year 2000, the United States government established a partnership for the critical infrastructure security, which is a partnership between the government and the private sector that aimed to improve the protection and resilience of America's critical infrastructure sectors. And this was seen as a landmark move at that time. And since then, cybersecurity has evolved into an operational domain in its own right. And just to kind of turn the lens to Singapore, one of Singapore's first major PPP projects in the cyber domain was the Cyber Watch Center. And this was a center for monitoring cyber threats to government networks and acts as an early warning system for possible cyber attacks. And since then, our PPPs have focused on workforce development, research, and innovation and information sharing. So I would like to start off by asking Mr. Godey, what policies and regulations have proven to be effective in facilitating cyber collaboration between the government and the private sector in your country?
Well, seeing as you mentioned critical infrastructure, I might start with there. I wasn't going to. I think public-private partnerships, we often try to think of the really generative partnerships by choice, and I think a bit like the fact that you don't get to choose your family sometimes, you don't get to choose your parents, sometimes some entities shouldn't get to choose whether or not they are in a partnership with the government. So you talked about critical infrastructure. Australia likewise likes to think that we have a world-leading critical infrastructure security regime, particularly as it pertains to cybersecurity. We're very fortunate in our legislature in Australia that it can be quite agile. So in 2018, we had a series of legislation. In 2022, that was amended, putting very specific requirements on cybersecurity. And in 2023, we're amending the legislation again based on the cybersecurity incidents over the last 12 months. So I think collectively that builds resilience and recovery when it comes to a nation. But the key part to it is governments practicing what they preach and having an agile legislative and regulatory framework that allows that to happen. In Australia at the moment, we're a few weeks out from publishing our cybersecurity strategy, and in it we will discuss in significant detail where we see the future. The DNA of that cybersecurity strategy will be familiar to most of us. There are very few topics in cyber that no one's ever heard of. We're discussing the same topics that most of the world is. But of course it's corrected for Australia's geostrategic and cultural and societal context. Some of the areas that we'll see partnerships that will be slightly different to what would happen in other jurisdictions is, firstly, we are continuing to discuss the end-to-end preparedness for a cyber incident. So on one hand, the government has the requirement to set the legislation, to provide the education opportunities, and then ultimately the resource base, and companies also provide a resource base for an entity to set their risk profile. What is the risk we are going to set in cybersecurity as a company or a government? And then they should be practicing and rehearsing and tabletopping, and hopefully that's all that ever happens. Of course, insert a lightning bolt and there is a cyber incident, how do we respond? And then off the back of the cyber incident, how do we learn lessons? Australia wants to find a new way of thinking about that end-to-end preparedness as a nation, and the answer is not that we're going to do that ourselves. If the government is conducting a review on the government's response to a government cyber incident, we are skipping where the expertise exists, which is in MSPs and other service providers that could be there. Another area that we're really driving forward in, and this will be my last point, is in threat sharing and threat blocking. Threat sharing would be familiar to most of you, and the way that we're envisaging it would be broadly consistent with the approach in other jurisdictions. But in threat blocking, Australia really sees itself trying to raise the bar in what we're comfortable with one private entity asking another private entity to block. And at its simplest, that seems pretty straightforward. If you have a threat that everyone in the world would agree is a website that should be taken down, or whatever the case may be, could you ask this telco to block the DNS or whatever as it comes into Australia? But as you march those threats on, where do we as a nation stop being comfortable with the country not being involved and two companies working together to block on behalf of all of Australians? It's a fascinating topic. It comes to our culture, and it comes to the way that we have confidence that we will have to get more agile and have industry at the heart of our threat blocking, as opposed to looking at the country to do it all using traditional sophisticated means.
Thank you so much. So what I took away, agile legislative approach, coupled with also a focus in terms of areas on end-to-end cyber preparedness and also on threat sharing and blocking. I'll open it up also to Ambassador Wexler to comment.
Thank you very much. Sometimes I think it's important that we look back also to past successes, and of course the future is never as the past has been. But it always strikes me there's one international organization which has survived from the era of the League of Nations, and it's the International Labour Organization. And you could ask, well, why? There may be different reasons, but the reason I took for myself is it was the first organization who brought together in a tripartite council the governments, the trade unions, and the employers' associations. And back then, I mean, the relationship between trade unions and employers' associations, I think, wasn't at a harmonious state. But they still thought, if we want to improve the situation of the workers in the world, we have to bring all the important stakeholders together. I think that's something also where we are at that stage with the tech industry, and that we need these public-private partnerships in a much more solid way, also more permanent way, And also that I think the industry sees, well, there's always space for lobbying, or that you need the best framework for your industry to operate. But at a certain time, you have to also see, well, there's an infrastructure where you're thriving on. And that when you're such an important part of that infrastructure, you need to be part of the building and securing of this infrastructure, where it's not about lobbying, but where it's really about collaborating together to save this common good. I think there comes then the trust. When you build the infrastructure together, and then you start knowing each other's preferences and needs. And I think also, I wore these running shoes actually intentionally, because especially we as the governments, we have to be a bit faster.
Great point.
They're
Great
Swiss,
reminder.
by the way.
Great reminder to us who are from the public sector of the need to keep up the pace. I want to now invite our panelists from the private sector side, the industry side. What are your thoughts on what kind of government policies and regulations will be facilitative in your perspective? From the point of view that I think we also not just want to look at what has worked in the past, but also what should we do going forward? Where should we do next in this area?
So I'll start off, and I want to maybe bridge off of General Goldie's comments around some of the blocking and other aspects that we're starting to see, because I think this is a common trend that we're seeing not only in Australia, but certainly we see initiatives here in Singapore regarding scams and other attempts where the pressure is now being put onto the ecosystem. Included in that ecosystem are all the major players, including ourselves, because in many cases these efforts are coming through a mobile device of some sort, right? So I do believe this is an opportunity. It's a forcing function opportunity. I feel that I think is a positive one. Sometimes I think it's going to be maybe odd hearing this from a manufacturer. I actually think the policies and the speed of the policies actually is helpful. I'd rather get a fast no than a slow yes on some of these policy definitions that we're seeing. A good example of this right now, and it's ironic that we're talking about trust so much when a lot of this is based on zero trust. And so the Biden administration, it seems like a long time ago, but it's been just over a year, on the executive order mandate around zero trust. It really put a forcing function on us as somebody that is a large provider to the U.S. as well as to allied countries, that it really sped up our efforts in regards to materializing that capability. And for us, it was really very much of it helped to shape our thinking within the organization. Because keep in mind, we're producing something like 600,000 mobile devices a day. So, and all of them have inherent security built in from the manufacturer. So having that sort of clarity on the policy side is something that, again, we took from a Samsung perspective, and myself more on the business to business and the government side. That clarity actually is something that we appreciate, or I certainly appreciate in terms of that guidance. So what I found is that the frequency and the definitional architecture of what is being produced now is quite different than what we saw, I think, 10 years ago. It was much more loosely defined. I'm seeing it much more tightly defined. I view it as a positive. Would love to hear other perspectives on it, but it's been a guiding force. I hope that we can do more of that, and in a way that is a little bit more consolidated overall.
So I'll jump in here. For me, I break this into carrot and stick. And so on the carrot side, the governments around the world are big customers. And so when they exercise vendor risk management, and the things that they go to their technology vendors and say, I need you to do these things before I feel comfortable buying, and being prescriptive and detailed in terms of what the bar is that needs to be cleared. And we've seen this in the US with the executive order around secure software development framework, and being able to attest that as the software producer to the customer, that we comply with these different practices. And so that's at the carrot side. I can go to the business and say, we should do this. By the way, I was saying that 3 years ago, but you should really listen to me now because you've got revenue at risk. And then the business listens and they see this as an area of active investment. On the stick side, I want to introduce a term here, commercially reasonable security. And so nobody wants to be caught out failing to implement commercially reasonable security practices, because if you don't have that in place and something bad happens to you, you're setting yourself up for a bad time when it comes to litigation and other types of exposure. And so one of the things that I think the different governments around the world, UK NCSC, and the US CISA, is what Jen Easterly was talking about on stage earlier this morning. One of the things I really like that they've done is the known exploitable vulnerability list, the KEV list, KEV. And so I've got tens of millions of assets inside of Cisco. Each of those assets probably have hundreds of patches that I could choose to deploy on any given day. But the KEV list has a few dozen exploitable vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited in the real world. And so of everything I could be doing, I should focus on that first, because if I get popped because I failed to apply a patch to address one of these KEV vulnerabilities, that's going to be a bad day for me. And so it really makes it more clear where that commercially reasonable line is. And it makes it easier for me to work with the business to say, we cannot fall below this level of practice, because we're going to look really bad when something happens to us. And so I think in terms of shaping incentives, doing things to help define and then raise that bar over time of what commercially reasonable security looks like. And so it's things like the KEV list, the use of multi-factor authentication. There's lots of other good practices that are out there. But when does something go from a good practice or a best practice to commercially reasonable and negligent if you don't do it? And so I think as that bar raises over time, it's going to help the industry overall deliver better outcomes.
Excellent. So I think the common theme between Casey and Brad's remarks is really about the role that governments can play together with the industry in terms of standards and best practice setting, as well as propagation and adoption, which is a really great point.
I'd love to add one
Yes.
more thing to Brad. He triggered something in my head. It was something we were talking about before the session. It's a little bit of an ask on my part. We spend a lot of resources around certification for certain levels of security and acceptance and compliancy. And the best standard out there right now, or the most common standard, is common criteria, as we talked about, right? But what I'm seeing more and more of is we are doing a lot of sovereign type of work as well. So this is BSI in Germany, NCSC in UK, ASD in Australia and others. And one of the things we find, just because we have to do these things, is that there is a lot of commonality, even in the sovereign work that we do. So again, one of the things that I think could help speed up, or at least drive, again, more acceleration in this area is for us to, again, running faster with the shoes, is getting more agreement, especially at that more of the classified level, which then trickles down to everybody else. I think synchronization there, especially in kind of the world picture that we live in now, would be exceptionally helpful. But again, that's one of my ask lists, if you will, in terms of the public-private partnerships that we have with many governments around the world.
Great. So the point about certification, it's a useful point for us to transit to this second factor on information sharing arrangements, and which was also one of the factors for successful public-private partnerships. Yet, I think the challenge, I think we need to talk about the challenges of information sharing arrangements that actually, to Casey's point that he brought up, classified information. Security issues and strict required clearances can quite often limit the information by the private sector with, that they can share with that the public sector can share with the private sector. And this can make the shared information quite generic, not actionable, and thus reducing the value of partnerships. So stringent review processes in the public sector can also delay the processes for this release of time-critical information. And information sharing may not therefore take place in a very meaningful way. So I would like to ask the panelists, what are the necessary conditions for us to engender sharing of information between the public and private sectors? And what are some good information sharing practices that you have come across in the cyber domain? I'd like to open up to the panelists.
Well, maybe the triggered what
Yes.
Kees was saying on the labeling or certification. I think what we've seen, we had one project launched by the Swiss Digital Initiative. They were defining a digital trust label. And, that was that companies would agree, okay, we share these kind of norms. We are ready to accept the highest standard. And we are getting audited also for this. So, and that you create some sort of transparency also how you get there. And I think that's a very important step to that you make it transparent. You can still have areas that are covered by non-disclosure, or that you can create a sandbox or something, but that at the end somebody who buys your product or your service knows, okay, this has been going through this procedure, and this creates trust. And then I think it's also very important that we bring the peers together that can really talk as experts about it. Because very often it's two different languages that are being spoken. On the one hand, the regulator, and then the industry. And I think if you bring really the experts together, that creates also the trust. And you need to create meaningful partnerships where this dialogue, this information can also pass. So I think that's, for us, what has been proven the most efficient.
Thank you so much. So bringing the experts together, making the rules for information sharing transparent so that all stakeholders can participate in that process.
Yeah, and I think
Brad?
the key issue is that for effective information sharing to occur, you need to have a situation where the group that's sharing the information needs to have confidence that it's not going to be used against them later. Otherwise, it becomes much more difficult to come forward. And I have some concrete examples here. So the U.S. has stood up the Cyber Safety Review Board. And this is modeled after the National Transportation Safety Board that investigates airplane crashes. NTSB has subpoena power. CSRB does not. And so it's a purely voluntary exercise where you can go forward and they want to talk about Log4j response or lapsus attack techniques or things like that. And the discussion inside a company like Cisco, when we get the invitation to show up, and they say, we don't have to do this. Why would we do this? Anything we share, you don't know who else is going to use this information to come yell at us later. And so the United States Security and Exchange Commission, the FBI, like there's a plaintiffs' counsel for class action lawsuits. There's all sorts of ways that us talking in this forum can come back to hurt us. And we don't have to. So why should we do it? And so I have to, step over the bodies of my lawyers saying, don't do it, holding onto my feet, trying to keep me from going out of the room. But I know that as an industry, we can only improve through feedback loops. And you need honest, accurate information about what happened in a particular event in order to achieve that feedback loop. And so I want to see CSRB get off the ground and be effective. And so I'm able to kind of talk down the risks that legal's bringing up. And so far, so good, like it hasn't come back and bitten us. But the next time that we get some kind of, SEC letter or something like that, and they're using testimony that we gave in a CSRB filing, I'll never be allowed out the room again. Because they'll say, this brings risk to us, we don't see the benefit. Like, it's nice to save the world and try to be helpful, but not at the cost of impacting Cisco's business and bringing negative outcomes to what we're trying to do. And so trying to create venues where you can show up and have, in good faith, like, here's what happened, the good and the bad, and then we can all learn from that. That's the positive. But we need to figure out a way in order to prevent it from being used against the people that are bringing the testimony. And I think that's the real necessary condition in order for effective information sharing.
Great point. I mean, no offense to the lawyers who may be in this room, but yes, I think for cybersecurity folks who are working in this space, quite often I think having to work with the legal side of the house is definitely a challenge, to information sharing. Thanks so much. Let us turn to the third factor that we posed, which is about platforms for regular collaboration. And I think we all know that cybersecurity is a cross-cutting issue, and having a common platform to bring together public and private entities has proven useful in many situations, such as facilitating coordinated responses to cyber incidents and pulling together resources, expertise, and tools to develop better cybersecurity capabilities. Ambassador McFetus, I'd like to ask you, what cybersecurity areas would benefit from having platforms for regular collaboration and why?
Boy, thank you. You and your team put together a lot of helpful materials in preparation for this session. And there was one that jumped out at me, so I printed it out from your program. It says, governments are increasingly looking into cybersecurity strategies that include collaborations between public and private sector. That resonated with me because, I'm working with a group of companies that I'm coming in from the outside, so I have first impressions. And you might think like, well, if you go into a business association, you're going to quickly hear that they hate all the government regulation. They want the government to stay, 100 miles from them. That's not the case. I mean, what I find in my early days of, dialogues with, experts in various companies is they want the same thing. They want a safe, cyber environment where nobody's being hacked and people can safely communicate. They want it in some cases maybe more than the governments because it's not only important, but it's their commercial opportunity. So I see, particularly when you look at ASEAN, the tremendous growth of the digital market that's expected. There's going to be more challenges, more reasons to work together. So I guess I'm surprised at the fact that when I dive into the discussions that that our organization is having about how can we collaborate, it's sort of like, how do we do more? We're working with the Singapore government intensively in a very productive relationship. I think the companies would like to do that more around ASEAN with more of the governments.
Excellent. Yes, indeed, ASEAN continues to digitalize at a very fast pace. And with digitalization on one side of the coin, cybersecurity is the other side. And if we all have shared goals, both public and private sector working together, actually we're all on the same side. And as my chief executive always says, cybersecurity is a team sport. And it is in fact also an international team sport where we actually all work together for a common good. May I ask if any of the other panelists would like to come in on this area of platforms for regular collaboration? Okay. If not, I think we'll turn to the last factor while ensuring that we keep time for questions. So the last one is one that is close to my heart. I'm an economist by training, so I think I have a biased belief in the value of incentives and benefits in influencing and motivating behaviors. So I think in situations where one party places greater priority on a shared goal, but has a higher dependency on the other party to achieve this goal, then incentives and financial arrangements can be quite helpful to make the partnership attractive to both sides. So I would like to ask, first starting with our industry panelists, what are the examples of incentives and benefits that we can use for public and private entities to collaborate, and what may have been some of the outcomes that you have seen that have been achieved through these collaborations that have tapped on incentives and benefits?
So I can throw out a couple examples. Many countries around the world have coordinating entities that exist within government, but they offer an amplification channel out to industry within that country. And so if I want to reach the top 1,000 enterprise organizations in Germany, I can go have a conversation with BSI, and that Federal Office of Information Security within the German federal government has the contacts to then take, and they'll do a filtering of what I'm telling them, and they'll filter out the silly, sales stuff that we're filling the channel with. But if there's real credible, good advice around configurations and things to look for, they can then push that out to their stakeholders, and that saves me 1,000 meetings, because I can just have one meeting with Germany. And same thing with CISA in the US or ASD in Australia. There's lots and lots of these groups, and NCSC in the UK. And so for us, anything that can be a leverage point and point of amplification, where we know that if we make an investment, that investment will be amplified out and lead to ultimately better outcomes for our customers. And this is where we have incentives aligned, where I want my customers to have good security outcomes. I want them to avoid bad outcomes where they might get upset with me. And if there's things around education, experience, if I can convince an expert that exists within government, and then they can turn around and say, hey, we vetted this and we agree this is really good advice. It's not just Cisco trying to make money, but you should actually go do this. And if it's upgrade to modern hardware, if it's don't deploy that module, whatever the advice is, if it gets filtered through a credible third party that exists within government, then there's a chance to drive better behavior and better outcomes in the end with our mutual customers there. So that's one channel that I think is really effective.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Casey?
I think Brad brought up earlier as well the idea of carrot and stick, sort of an approach. At least from my personal experience on it, the carrot approach tends to work better, at least from a vendor perspective. I don't think history has proven on the punitive side that works in anybody's behalf. It's also very difficult when we're talking about international law and other areas. I was sitting with a gentleman from Interpol last night, and we were having a discussion on this topic and the complexity of trying to get prosecution in situations where you're trying to get punitive damages. It comes to about 1% or something like that. Surprised to hear it was that low, but again, on the carrot side, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again. I think getting the incentive being the clarity, as well as now we're starting to see some subsidization as well as incorporation in budget that is specifically ring-fenced around this area. Particularly in the US, where in many cases we saw this kind of hidden in other things. Now it's being much more clearly articulated as a unique spend. And I think that's something that gives folks like Brad and I a lot more clarity around what we're talking about and how we should approach it versus trying to extract that from something that is something that is part of another legislative effort or another sort of funding effort. So I think to me that's key. The other thing, it's not on the incentive piece, but I think it is something that we do need to think about, is I think we have common challenges both on the private and the public sector side on just the paucity of talent that is available in this domain. If you read any of the studies, it ranges from something like, just in the US alone, I think there's 450,000 open positions at any given time in this field of discipline that we're talking about. So one incentive I would love for us to continue to work on, and I've seen certain countries implement this, is the implementation of things like almost a civil defense force. We've seen this happen in Ukraine, for example, and what's happened there, and that's been driven out of necessity, is the ability to create new opportunities and professions in this space to fill a gap that we have both on the technology vendor side as we do on the public sector side. So if we're going to be doing any joint incentivization, I would love to see us move into that space where there is policy and others that are driving joint training and other initiatives in that space together, because I think it solves, again, if we're all on the same team, we've got to recruit the rookies as well as the senior talent in the organization.
Yes. Ambassador Baxter?
Thank you, Casey. You brought me to a point which, when we talk about public and private, we shouldn't forget about academia and science. That's part of the public. And I mean, Silicon Valley, the digital age, AI, quantum computing would not happen if we wouldn't have invested massively in science. And I think also we made the experience that bringing in science into it's a trilateral cooperation between the governments and the private industry is really also a game changer. Because we saw it now, for instance, with an initiative we started on AI, where we wanted to develop real formats where companies could exchange information on their models in a trusted manner. And the universities, they can build up a secure framework where they can do this. And then the companies are also, they have trust in doing this when there's the science abroad. And they meet the talents of today and of the future. So they have also this interest in, and it's also rewarding for the scientists to have this exchange with the companies. So for instance, we did this, I didn't know this word before, but red teaming. I mean, every company does red teaming, but they don't share how they do it. So how can I trust Samsung's red teaming if I don't know it? But if we can have Cisco and Samsung comparing their red teaming and learning in a sort of anonymous way without giving away, of course, some company secrets, and that, under the guidance of the scientists who are really sometimes already, again, some steps ahead, or developing new secure internet architecture. I mean, the World Wide Web was invented at CERN in order to better able to exchange information. So I think that's also an incentive that we, as the governments, of course, science and research should be independent. But I think that is also something that we can put into the equation, which is of great interest for the private sector and for everybody at the end.
Great points from all. I think we touched upon how can the public sector work together with the private sector to amplify and plan also, I think, these collaboration structures going forward, set aside resources, as well as academia that we must not forget. And of course, importantly, the area of talent is one that we have to focus on, because there is a shortage of talent in the cyber domain. And going forward, how can we address this really as a group rather than private sector and public sector being competitors? I now want to turn to the questions that have been posed to the panel by the audience. First question first. Who should take the initiative to build a public-private partnership? Interesting one.
Yeah.
Darren?
I think governments, of course, have a role in articulating what they seek from industry, but it doesn't mean that they should be the only people that have a view. I think my short answer to that it totally depends. And I would hope that governments can build the layers of trust and transparency that incentivise the private sector to approach the public sector, not only with proposals in big kind of business terms, but even just information.
Thank you. Any views, other views from the panel?
I would say I'm coming out of a career in government, and I would think that it actually is probably, in the public-private partnerships that I've seen, it probably usually does start with government, I think. Maybe people can name exception, but I'm thinking, like, at the end of the day, the government is kind of the agenda setter in many areas, and the companies are individuals, so they have to respond, I think. But so that would be my inkling, that it kind of has to start with the government. But I'd be happy to have people disagree.
I agree.
Okay.
So, but I'll give you some. I'll give you some examples here. So, I'll frequently get together with ad hoc groups. So, the people who do my job at Cisco, I'm at Cisco, so my friends that run security at Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, we get together for dinner. We don't invite the government to that dinner because we want to talk about the government and complain about the government.
That's
and
important.
yeah,
that's an important platform.
exactly. And so when we go and interact with government, I don't bring Microsoft with me. It's just Cisco going to government. And so we approach government one-on-one. And so if government wants to have all of us in a room, they need to invite us and then kind of lay out the ground rules of what we're going to talk about and what's going to happen. And so I think that's, and we're eager to show up to those parties, but it's really tough if we're going to convene a group of industry and then we invite government. Then everyone's like, who invited the government? Like, why'd you ruin a good party? So that's like the reality of how it works. And so I think for government to convene the multi-party groups, then we can show up to that. And then when private industry convenes multi-party groups, we'll usually do just industry because it's just a lot easier. Because if we invite government, then we have to invite the lawyers, we have to invite the government affairs team, and it just becomes very big and heavy. So it's easier when government does it.
I think the framework should be done by the government. And again, Brad mentioned earlier, because we're traveling in some of the same circles like with BSI, with NCSC and others, there has to be something that sets an agenda, sets a prerogative, sets a policy, and says, okay, well, what are you going to do about this, right? Hit the goal, right? So I think that's really important because there's only so much you can do. I mean, we do a fair amount of joint ideation with customers and many governments that come through, Korea or one of our R&D facilities, but the scale is not there. I applaud organizations that have taken the initiative around some of these initiatives and efforts like US DoD does a nice job through what they call DIU or Defense Innovation Unit. It's actually headed up by an ex-Apple executive now, where it makes it, I don't want to use the word convenient, but that's the term that comes to mind for me, is the ability to use that as a mechanism for amplification through all different agencies and departments and others that would not necessarily be accessible to us if we were to do it point to point. So again, if we're looking for scale, it's definitely something where the government needs to lead that particular dance.
Excellent.
Could I say one thing on it? I think one of our challenges too is we are potentially short of the inflection point when it comes to a shared understanding of risk. And that doesn't mean, government knows more about this or private knows more about this. If you use normal, state-on-state conflict as an example, we're all extremely slow and bureaucratic until we have a reason to stop being slow and bureaucratic and go fast. And unfortunately, conflicts over history show what can be achieved when government industry works together to do amazing things. I wonder to what extent the changing risk environment in cyber is causing a different response from both ends of that spectrum and when they're working together. If I use an Australian example, we've had 4 major cyber breaches in the last year that broadly mean that every Australian's data is sitting on the dark web now. So, we're all getting new driver's license and all getting new passports and it's all happening. So Australia is a pretty good place right now. You can get a cyber strategy through and everyone's really motivated and everyone really wants to work out. But if this just settles down for a couple of years, we'll just re-enter our bureaucratic processes. So I wonder, as the cyber security risk continues to evolve and, we've touched on AI and it's probably the longest panel I've ever had without talking more about AI, which is fantastic. At what stage do we just go, right, we've just got to get all in here and fix the problems?
Yes, indeed. It's a very timely reminder that actually we also have to think about the cyber threat landscape and the risk, because it is not just about something that is static. And we actually have to keep thinking also about the adversary, how that landscape is changing, and therefore how can we all collectively as a team work to counter that. So great point. Let's talk about, there's a question about fair PPP. What expertise does government need to regulate cybersecurity?
Well, I had, when I started up our new division on digital foreign policy, I was able to recruit new people. And I was looking a little bit around, what do we have in the ministry? And we really had nobody who was really an expert on cybersecurity. So I went out, and I was lucky. I could recruit a senior cybersecurity expert who's on the board of organizations like FIRST, who has extensive experience. And for us, there's a whole world opened up. I think that is really, for us, the first thing to say, we need to bring this expertise into the government. And indeed, they have totally different styles, and they dress differently. That's why you probably have a more fun evening with your Apple colleagues than if you are in for dinner with diplomats, maybe. And I was also posted in San Francisco as consul general and a tech ambassador, and I was struck by these developers conferences. This is something we completely ignore. We have our UN bodies and committees where we meet. We have our rituals and procedures. But, maybe we also have to get a little bit the way of life and the way of working. Because when you think there's such developer conference, if we would do this as a state, as government, it's a fantastic way how you bring in expertise, you have a good time, and then you improve your product. So I think it's also, we don't have to necessarily organize a governmental Burning Man festival or something, but get a little bit of that sense of what's the vibrations in the tech sector. I think with that we would also have much better PPPs, because everybody would learn from each other and also feel more at ease, because the format is different.
Indeed, it's about the different worlds coming together closer. The technical part of cyber, the diplomatic part of cyber, having just more interactions and understanding each other's perspectives. So that then I think together we are bridging, I think, that difference today, because each sees the world from a certain lens. But I think as we are able to come together, I think at a session like this, we are actually bringing different perspectives together.
I think I wonder to what extent too there is another challenge that we're trying to solve, that the whole world has almost the same challenge. So I mentioned the term earlier that Australia's cybersecurity strategy would look like the DNA of most other countries. Actually, it looks like a cut and paste of a lot of other countries, because it is so similar. When someone's on the other side of the world using a Samsung or a Cisco product, there you go, you're welcome. When someone's on the other side of the world using a Samsung or a Cisco product there, they're probably using it there, they're probably using it there, it looks the same, it operates the same, chances are the legislation is the same. Whereas if we talk about the physical world, you're talking about building standards, it's so reliant on the local context, the weather, this or this or this. So I think it's very important when it says what expertise does government need, we need to remember, the whole bumper sticker about cyber and borders, but we need to understand that chances are someone else in the world is solving the same problem that you're trying to solve. Exactly the same problem.
Excellent. I want to give time, I think, to this question, which is about balancing the profit motives and public interest can be challenging. And how do we address accountability issues as we progress towards more public partnership efforts? I think for those of us who are at the third panel in the morning, Jen Easterly talked about cyber being an economic problem, and we have to look at incentives and how do we also enable secure by design and default for products and services. So I want to open this question to the panel.
Well, maybe I can start. I visited recently in Paris the Technical Museum, and I saw they were pioneers in aviation. And Blériot, he was crashing every week a new plane. I think he had about 30 planes that he crashed. So, and he improved his planes every time he crashed. and because it was a new technology, it was a new era. And I think that's sometimes we forget the digital age, it's still a young technology. And we're still, a lot of things is just, done by some people somewhere. We take it, okay, works, blah, blah, blah. So it's still not a mature industry. And when you look at how the aviation is regulated today, hopefully it's much better than back in Blériot's time, when he built his own airplane. But he would have never been able to build this plane if he had the strict regulations of today, because then he would have been in jail. But we had this trial and error, but I think we have to catch up, and I think also it's part of the duty of the private sector to invest part of the profit which you make in a pioneering, adventurous time into more security. And that was my really disillusioning and frustrating experience when we visited a big tech company in Silicon Valley, I asked, why don't you participate in this dialogue, Geneva dialogue between companies where Microsoft and others are all participating? And they said, well, we don't have enough resources. And I won't name the company, but believe me, if they don't have enough resources, nobody has. And I think that's really a little bit of a shift where companies have said, well, maybe we have to invest a little bit more of our profits also in the security.
Great. So it's also working together, engaging big tech, and how can we create better security together for the end users. We're coming round to the end of today's session. Time flew by, but I wanted to really end by looking forward to the future. I think we hadn't touched on Gen AI, but I wanted to keep this last question, I think, to the panel, considering that Gen AI and other emerging technologies like quantum computing would have impact on our cyber resilience, and how can public-private partnerships prepare for these disruptive technologies in your view? So,
No idea. The book, Thank You for Being Late by Friedman, talks about the pitfalls of legislating too early, and he used the example of Uber, the rideshare platform, and some jurisdictions jumping in to legislate early and getting caught horribly short, and they've had to back out of that. Think about some cities in the world that ban them and others that said only taxis can do them. We're starting to approach that stage with AI, and I think it's very challenging. I think that intersection with quantum that we always talk about, we know mass decryption is at least within a decade. The two paired together will fundamentally change everything that we know. So at some stage, fools have to rush in now and start to legislate, otherwise we're going to be caught horribly short. But it is a bit of a cautionary tale about if you start trying to legislate AI now, you really are stabbing in the dark in many ways.
Well, Switzerland, we tried to find an answer to this in a discipline called science diplomacy. We started an initiative in Geneva called the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator, who is a radar which looks at all technologies, what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 25 years. And they evaluated the different technologies, and they said, well, quantum is really the next big thing where we have now a little bit of time in order to prepare. We know already what kind of codes or passwords are not will be obsolete with quantum. We can already prepare. And what kind of governance do we need if quantum will be at the speed and the performance that it will be? That's for sure. And the same thing on AI. I think we really have to work on very practical solution to reduce the risks, so that we can take advantage as much as possible from the opportunities. And again, I think cybersecurity is a good learning ground. What tools have worked in order to improve cybersecurity? I think we can use these models also and adapt them to the AI world.
Great. Thank you. Ambassador.
2 quick comments. One is, it strikes me, going back to the platforms comment at the beginning of your session, that like this is an area that's going to require in-depth discussion, and my organization has been able to sponsor those, but that's not unique to USABC. The second thing I would say is people, like I put myself in this category, people need to learn more about it. And there's initiatives like with the Singapore government, the US has this third country training program. I think those are wonderful. We also have a small business enterprises program where we're offering courses in this. So, bringing people along, I think, is part of this too.
So I did a little prep work thinking about this, and I've got a very tactical, perhaps off-the-wall way of thinking about things. So if you're looking for something concrete that you can do in a technical environment that will make things better for security outcomes, I think focusing on the age of assets within that environment and moving ideally towards what we call ephemeral assets. And so when I am working at Cisco and we're comparing the relative security hygiene of one cloud to another, and so WebEx is a cloud and Duo is a cloud. We have like 100 different clouds that we sell. And if you say, how old is the average server in this environment? And the bigger that number is, the worse it is for security, because you get drift, you get a lot of unintended effects. Servers become snowflakes over time because they accrue a bunch of different cruft over it. But if you show me a cloud environment where the average age of a server is 4 hours, every single server is exactly as it should be, and it doesn't last long enough to drift out of date. And so I think that's something that's a truism across environments. And so if you've got TLS certificates that expire in 10 years, you're going to have an outage in 10 years in 1 day. But if you have TLS certificates that expire in 15 days, you're going to have automation to renew them. You'll never have an outage. And so I think if you're looking at an environment and trying to think about how can we drive towards ephemeral assets, things that get produced through automation, and then stood up and torn down very quickly with automation in order to guarantee configuration, that's going to deliver better outcomes. And so this is a very tactical thing. It's easy to say, hard to do. But I think if you talk to your vendors and ask them how old are the assets in this environment, and if they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, old, it's not going to be as good as if they can give you a crisp answer and they know what's going on.
Thank you. Casey?
The last word on this one, right?
The last word from the panel on this one.
So I think the way I would answer this is, I have a friend of mine, his name is Rick Lewis, and Rick runs systems for IBM. He has quantum as part of his remit. And he and I have known each other for 30 plus years. We go back towards HP days and IBM days. And we had lunch, and one of the things we talked about, I said, is, Rick, this is the first time in the history of computing where, in essence, most people will never ever buy, even the largest companies or governments are not going to buy a quantum computer. What they'll buy is they'll buy services from quantum services, as will practically everybody else, because this, the need for the infrastructure and all the things that you need to do to set this up. So it'll be the first platform that will completely bypass physical stuff showing up in your data center. And so what this means, I think, is going to be, number one, I think it's closer than we think. Secondly, it's going to be more ubiquitous than we think, which is going to present some incredible challenges for us in terms of who can have access to this type of capability. Now, that'll drive a whole set of policy decisions onto itself. But my sense of it is, and my last point on this is, I really think that we have to be in a situation where we fight fire with fire to a degree. And my point on this is really simple. And again, I'm just talking from my domain of expertise. I can't speak for everybody else, but we're effectively carrying around in our pockets something that is the equivalent of a late 80s generation supercomputer. Multiply that by 5 on the communication side, and that's what you have. So what we're thinking about, and certainly as owning this part of the business at Samsung, is we're really thinking about how do we put AI in service of defending against these types of environments, right? So, multi-factor authentication, continuous multi-factor authentication, at attestation at a very, very low granularity, ensuring that you are who you are, that the application is what it is, you're on the network that you think you are. All those things are going to require a tremendous amount of capability. So, that would be kind of, again, what's keeping me up at night, right, is the things that we do today are not going to be good enough. But I do think that there's merit in that. And if I look at the technology curve that we're on, both on the quantum side as well as what's happening kind of on the access to those services, that's where we're putting some of our focus right now.
Great, thank you so much. I think on that note, I think it has certainly been a very enriching and thought-provoking discussion. I think this discussion has given me a sense of optimism for the future in terms of how the public and private sectors have and will continue to work together on a shared goal so that we can create a more secure digital future for everyone. So before we end this session, because we have overrun by quite a bit, I shall not attempt to summarize it, but I want to extend our very heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed panelists, Air Marshal Darren Gildea, Ambassador Benedict Wexler, Ambassador Brian McFetus, Mr. Brad Atkin, and of course, Mr. Casey Choi for sharing your wisdom and experiences. So thank you so much, I think, to all the panelists for your generous sharing. And let us give them a big round of applause for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let's give it up for our moderator, Hui Lee. Thank you so much for moderating this exciting segment. Thank you. I'd like to invite our panelists to kindly proceed off stage and be seated. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, it is engaging and also optimistic. And next up, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that all of you have benefited tremendously from this segment as we share with you about securing the future, public-private partnerships for cyber resilience. And thank you for your excellent questions as well. Now, I just want to remind all of you, if you want to look back, we will have a session that is on demand on the SICW website at your convenience right after the event. So you can play back on demand to watch again for this particular high-level panel. All right, so our next high-level panel will commence at about 4 p.m. The topic is Ransomware Exposed, Insights into Operations and Safeguarding Techniques. So we'd like to see you back at this studio at 4 p.m. See you then. Thank you.